hopefully has a little bit more bandwidth. So good evening and welcome everybody to Happy Hours. It's January 15th. With me, I'm Eileen Cook, and this is our crafty hour where we talk all things craft. And Alyssa, I wonder if you wanted to speak a little bit about, you had a specific question about telling characters apart.
Yeah, so I have a scene where my characters get captured by raiders. So there's kind of 5 brand new people. And I wanted them to all be related, like they're all like brothers or cousins or brothers-in-laws. So they have somewhat similar characteristics. I've tried to differentiate them, but I just got some feedback from a beta reader that she struggled a bit in that scene to differentiate them. Like I made one really tall, I made one mute. But I guess I still need to, I don't know. And then I've just read like George R.R. Martin where he's got 1,000 characters, and the only time I have trouble keeping them apart is when they have the same name.
Yeah, don't give them the same name. That is my first piece of advice. And I would make only one of them a mute at a time. I think that's also probably good advice. So a few things I think you can do that will help. So one is look at how they might speak on the page. So you might have one character that, for example, has a stutter. So in his lines of dialogue, there might be like a t-t-t-t. So if someone sees that actually visually on the page, they think, oh, right, that's the guy who stutters, even if they don't necessarily remember his name. Or someone who has an odd speech pattern where they, or a contemporary character who says something like, oh, fiddlesticks, like that would stick out because that's not something most people do very often. Or they use a particular type of vocabulary or language or something like that that might become a way to sort of differentiate when they're actually speaking. So using dialogue like that. Also looking at, instead of using dialogue tags at some point, you might use action. So you might use action. Eileen stood up from the library and walked across the room. So something where anytime that there's a line of dialogue, it's really clear who is connected to that line. And if I'm, for example, Eileen talking to Bonnie, who had just entered the room, and then the next line of line is clearly from Bonnie. So that may help sort of differentiate that Bonnie is a separate character. So that might help a little bit. And then also acknowledging sometimes it is just going to be difficult if you have a scene where, 5 people in one scene, if they're talking and interacting and taking action, is going to be challenging. So this might seem like a bizarre question, but if I confuse them, is that going to cause a big crisis of understanding what's happening in the scene? So it may be a thing where I might think that Crystal is the one who grabbed the magical ring. Someone else thinks it's Kirsten. Someone else thinks it's Bonnie. But if at the end of the day, what's important is that one of these raiders grabbed the ring, then that's maybe just enough in and of itself that we just have that moment. So making sure like whatever the plot point that happens is distinct is going to be easier. Now, the next thing to think about is, are these going to be reoccurring characters? So are these 5 raiders going to show up a lot, or is it just kind of this one scene?
They're basically kind of in, I don't know, maybe a third of the book.
Okay, so
they're kind of continuous once they show up for a bit until they're done.
Yeah, then I would definitely look particularly around speech patterns, or if there's any sort of physical activity. So if it's Eileen, maybe I walk with a lurching step, or I'm always tripping or falling. And so there's comments about, Eileen, you're such a klutz. And it sounds like you already have some of that, because like mute, for example, would be something where that's going to be a very distinct person. So whenever they're trying to communicate something, it's going to have to be a physical action. Tall may be like, make sure you're looking for ways that it's very clear that I'm tall. So I'm bumping my head constantly, or someone's having to look up to talk to me. So again, just sort of reinforcing. So sort of picking 1 or 2 things that is distinct for each character will be a little bit helpful. I'm curious for everyone else, is there any tricks that you guys use when you have a scene with multiple people in it to make sure the reader is staying clear about who's who? Like, Tony, you do a lot of action scenes. Is there something you think about?
Well, I've got a different inflection. Like one character is English, I got one character like from Boston area. So I try and yeah, I think I'm using different language. At least that's what I'm trying to do, like a different words and sort of different inflections as I'm going through it.
I do think dialogue is often the easiest way to distinguish people on the page, because it's not just what they say, but sometimes even just how it looks. So if one person always uses really short sentences, they don't say much. Everything is like, you can't, period. Be serious, period. And that's the way they're constantly speaking, then they're going to pop on the page, even just when I see them that way. Or if they're always using, you know, the $5 word when a $2 word would suffice, that's the kind of thing that when I see they say, instead of they say, you stink, they say, you're malodorous, right? Like, then that's someone where you're like, okay, that's that guy who never thought of a word that he couldn't use that was too large. So those are the things I think that will probably help the most. Anyone else want to chime in on Bonnie?
Also indicate a bit of their personality. Like one person might be more impatient, and that can come up, like their tone can come across. One might be a little more nurturing, or one, you know, they're pretty easygoing, and the other one's like, come on, you know, let's get on with it. And so that is with dialogue or with their actions that can kind of distinguish them, especially if you have, like in your case, it's probably the Raider group. So gonna have one that will stand out as a leader. And he's gonna have certain leadership qualities that the others react to. He might be more abrupt, or he might be more matter of fact, or I don't think he's going to be very, you know, laconic and chatty, you know. Whereas you do have one character that seems to be very into his family. So then he would probably be a little bit more, hey, you know, let's do this, or our family is important, you know, kind of just interspersing that every once in a while, and you're like, okay. So I just find that you can impart a lot about their tone through the dialogue.
So what might be helpful for you is to do, and this is going to make Bonnie's heart grow 3 sizes and Tony's too, well, Crystal's too, look at this little trifecta of hoops, is to think about making yourself a spreadsheet where you list, I know you're also excited. Not that I would actually ever do this. I would do it all completely on index cards, but in theory, you could do it on a spreadsheet. That would make sense.
Analog spreadsheet is index cards.
Yeah, or I would carve it on a stone tablet, you know, depending how I was feeling. But I would make myself a list on one side that would have the character names, and then I would do like physical characteristics and look at like, what is that for each person? Maybe speech characteristics, what is that for each person? Like as Bonnie's raised, like personality issues, like this is the outgoing one, this is the shy one, this is the leader, this is the one who's sarcastic, like kind of making some of those so that you could quickly reference, because sometimes what happens, I think, is we blur those people together. So for example, one of the problems I sometimes have is, you know, I like to have a funny little line here and there. And sometimes I start making all the characters funny. Because it amuses me, right? So I'm having a great time and I'm using that and I'm feeling really great about that. So I'm, you know, kind of giving every person just those perfect lines. But the truth is that, of course, a lot of people aren't funny or they don't have the perfect line at the right time. So, you know, assigning maybe one person who has that line, particularly if they're not going to be a main character where you're going to see them over the whole breadth of the book, just allows them to be a little bit more identifiable. Having said that, you're also not looking to make them too cliche, right? So, you know, thinking about that as you're putting that into play as well. Does that help or complicate? Oh, Crystal has a thought.
One more thing to add is on the physical side of things, often, like for bad guys, especially if they're just like random goons, then I don't know who they are from a name perspective. But if you have whatever your character would notice about them. Like if your character is a warrior, they would notice if they were a lefty in holding their sword, or if they had a particular symbol on their shield. So if you think about nicknaming each of the characters based on what the person who's the point of view character would describe them as, then that's a nice way to do it. It might be like red shirt, green hat, whatever, if your person is a clothing maker, or, you know what, it's like, if you're noticing cars, some people would notice the color, some would notice the make, some would notice the year. So if you know who your point of view character is, then you can pick that out as another way of sort of deepening the voice of your point of view character, as well as distinguishing your people.
Ooh, I like that. Write that down. That was a good one. Anyone else have thoughts on that? All right, I'm going to turn a little bit to talking about writer's block. And if you have a question, you're going to have to tell me, because I have only one screen. So I have now the document open in front of me, so I can't actually see you. So if you want to make faces at me, now would be the time, which makes me suddenly want to click back over. But all right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about writer's block, just because it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. And it kind of took me down a rabbit hole of Google and so forth. And it became sort of interesting. And I wanted to share those things with you, because I think you guys might find it interesting as well. So, of course, first off, what do we mean when we say writer's block? So it's basically the idea that either you can't write at all, or you're having trouble coming up with sort of original ideas, that kind of stuff. And I'm curious how many of you, I'm clicking back over, have struggled with writer's block, either at one time or another. A few show of hands. How does it show up for you? Are you finding that it's a long period of time? Is it just sort of a day here and there? I'm kind of curious what other people's experience is.
I find it gets it's like, if you think of it in terms of resistance, it's like the resistance increases the longer you let it.
Yeah. So the longer you're not writing, the worse it gets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Well, there's an inertia, right? And I agree, is that it's, if you haven't written, then you're mad at yourself for not writing, because you should be writing. And then in order to get started, oh God, it's just like trying to, push your car up a hill.
It magnifies.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It grows exponentially.
Yeah, it's like
mind games, right?
It's like exercise, right? The first time, if you haven't hit the gym for a while and you get into the gym and you lift
I don't know
one
anything
weight.
about that.
No,
Getting to the gym becomes increasingly difficult.
Yeah. The what's his name? The guy that did the War of Art.
Even Pressfield.
Yeah. That's a great book for writer's block, because and then the other one I just bought my son, it actually was one called Do the Work, which is it's just all about resistance,
So why do you think we have writer's block? Because I would say most people in this room, we would describe, because I get why we have, say, gym block. So for me, going to the gym is not something where I'm like, yeah, like I'm glad that I go, but why writer's block?
Because it's easier to couch surf and watch Netflix.
Definitely.
This is not an easy path that we've chosen.
I find it seasonal for me, and I go through fits and starts of energy, and this is now like the second or third time it's happened to me about this time of year. So clearly there's other things going on as well. So
I've always found it interesting, because writing is one of those things where when you talk to most writers, even though we do love Netflix, and trust me, I do love me a good Netflix show, we also love writing. So it always comes back to me, like, if I say this is something that I love doing, and I do love doing it, like, why am I not doing it? Like, what's going on? And there is that passive, like, oh, but it is work, so I'd rather not. I think there is sometimes, like you're talking about, Kristen, kind of that emotional stuff going on. So it's just was interesting for me to take a look at it. And the term writer's block actually didn't even come up until 1947. And it was a psychiatrist named Edmund Bergler who came up with that idea. And just in case you were wondering, like, how crazy are we? He hypothesized, and I'm quoting, that writing is a personal exorcism, and that only by doing writing can we exorcise those demons. So his theory was, if you are blocked, it is because it is basically either the demons are all out, congratulations, or you are still basically embattled with the demon and are not able to move forward. So I thought that was quite an interesting way of thinking about it.
I think we need fallow time.
Yes.
And that labeling it writer's block or anything else is not helpful, because, you know, just like staring out the window is part of the process, I think downtime is part of the process too. Whether it's generation of new story ideas or whether it's processing some of those deeper demons that need to be exercised. Or sometimes, you know, you have like a constellation of things that you're interested in, but they haven't gelled into a something yet that's got enough enough momentum to compel you to actually make it into something.
Well, and I want to break that in because I think there's kind of two different things that you brought up that I think are useful. So the first is something that I stole from Crystal. So I have to at least admit I stole it from her because she's here now and she can hear me talking. But one of the things that Crystal talked about is, you know, when we talk about writing, we often only define it as actually adding words on the page. But there's so much more to the process of writing that includes research, which includes thinking about it, which includes letting those ideas sort of come to fruition. And so there is a role of saying, you know, is it, as Marianne used the term, is it writer's block, or is it just that you're in a different period of writing? So I think that's one to think about. And I think it is, as Marianne used the term, like sometimes you do need to give yourself time and give those ideas time to really sort of, I don't know if I want to use the term fester, but that they need to sort of grow into something. And if you're sometimes pushing it,
Ferment.
Ferment. That sounds better. Sounds more like wine. And I do know for myself that there are definitely times that if I'm in the middle of a project and I'm struggling with writer's block, it's often because I'm trying to force the story to go in a direction that is on my outline, for example. But at some level, instinctive level, I know it's not the right direction for the story anymore. So it's like my brain is putting up the stop sign and saying, take a moment. Marianne.
I just had an idea, because I keep this on my desk. This is Mary's critique reaction card. This isn't what I wanted, but it reminded me of some notes that I took from a workshop with her like a year and a half ago at Surrey. And she talked about different kinds of blocks and what might be causing them. Were you there? Do you remember that?
I do remember.
I found that quite eye-opening, because if you are aware of those different sort of categories of blockages, it helps you to focus in on what it is you're not.
What is your blocking?
Admitting to yourself. Yeah.
And so I think that's really important. But I also want to put a pause in that there's also something to be said for having, like, as you talked about, fallow times. Like, I don't know if we always have to be in the middle of a project. And I think there are times that we actually have to respect and honor the idea that we're going to refill the well. And so that's the idea that maybe if you're not writing, are you reading? Are you going to museums? Are you seeing movies? Are you talking with friends? Are you spying at conversations in your local public library? Are you traveling? Are you doing things to input and kind of inhale and suck up all that sort of creative things, and not to necessarily give yourself a hard time for the fact that you're doing that? So I think that's really important to sort of recognize that those two things are going along.
I found during Nano, I don't have writer's block. I have writer's fear of not getting to the 50,000 words. And because I've got this deadline, I've got a freedom that it's like I'm writing, and I write notes, and the questions about the characters, those all count as words.
Yeah, and I think the power of Nano is really about turning off that internal critic, right, where you're sort of stopping yourself from writing. Mm-hmm. So again, down this rabbit hole in the 70s and 80s, out at Yale, they started looking at those two guys, Barrios and Singer, who were looking about blocked writers. And this will surprise you. They fell into basically 4 dominant groups. One was anxiety and stress. 2 was anger and irritation. 3 was apathetic. And 4 was hostile. So we're a happy little crowd, but they did summarize saying that, you know.
Which category does self-pity fit into?
Yeah. I think we're going to put that in. Let's see here. Maybe hostile, because it was hostile and disappointed.
And C, all of the above.
So strangely enough, that wasn't one of the options. But they talked about that it was the negative emotions that were preventing writers from finding the joy that they normally do in writing. And that basically it was stopping them. So things to think about.
I agree with that a lot. That so there's kind of the Stephen Pressfield way of looking at writer's block, that it's resistance and it's something you have to fight and you just have to get stronger and that's how you overcome it. And then the thing that worked better for me was there was a podcast called The Worried Writer. And she talks a lot about lying to yourself and saying, oh, I only have to write for 2 minutes. That's all I have to do. And just you tell yourself whatever lies you need to do to make it easy and to go. And then you congratulate yourself like, oh, you wrote for 2 minutes, you get a star. And like that sort of that complete opposite way of looking at it.
I was reading something online today that was exactly like that, Alyssa, and it was somebody was interviewing somebody else, and they said, "What do you do when you're just having one of those days when you can't?" And the reply was, "I lower my expectations."
I loved that quote.
I mean, whether it's just a shorter period of time or a shorter number of words, or like 3 words, right?
Well, and I think that's often the power that we have in the writing sprints that happen in the morning, is that there is a set block of time and, you're going to be there for that time. And I think for a lot of us, that gives us permission, like, well, then if I don't write for the rest of the day, at least I did that 1 hour block, right? So, and a 1 hour is actually a big one. If you read the book, Writing 5,000 Words in an Hour, he talks about building up writing habits. So he talks about setting a 5-minute timer, and it's basically a 5-minute nano, Tony, but you're just writing for that 5 minutes. You're doing everything that you can get out, and then you're counting the number of words that you get in that time period. And you're looking to kind of try to start besting that, just like a physical exercise activity, right? So then you're doing 10 minutes and then 20 minutes. And in his point, which I personally have not gotten to, but that you can be doing 5,000 words in an hour. Dare to dream. Dare to dream, right? But it's about his thing is, developing that habit of turning off the critic and just plowing through. But I thought it was interesting, this idea that, for a lot of blocked writers, it was around kind of emotional stuff. So it sort of looked to me like there was, different causes for writer's block. So there's like kind of creative problems, like you don't know how to tackle an issue, or you don't have an idea that you find particularly inspiring. Sometimes it's things like fear of success or rejection. We have both. And sometimes there's personal things going on. So you have stuff going on in your work life, your relations, your health, that is making it difficult for you to kind of focus in and get those words in. And of course, as only can happen when you're on Google, that led me down a different click hole, which was related to some stuff that I knew with my work, which is talking about the parts of the brain. And what's interesting is we know that a lot of what's happening in terms of problem solving and creativity is happening in your cerebral cortex, which is up near the front of your brain. But when you go into stress or anxiety, it takes you into your limbic system. And if you remember high school biology, your limbic system is where all the stuff is happening around fight or flight. So that's when your body is basically trying to figure out how to run from the saber-toothed tiger. Now, what happens when your brain goes in the limbic system is that your brain actually shuts down your ability to see a lot of different things and kind of focuses you in. So the idea is really, you have to get away from this basically tiger. And that is all you need to be worried about at this moment. And your brain doesn't let you pick up and notice other things. And that's great for running away from a tiger. It's not so great for creative writing. So one of the things that can happen is if you are dealing with stress and anxiety, what is happening is that you are, my phone is ringing in the library. What is happening is you are switching over to that lizard brain or the limbic system, and you are not existing where you need to be, which is in your cerebral cortex, which is what happens. So you've got to figure out how to get yourself back into the cortex. So often the first move to do is to basically step slightly and easily away from the laptop for a moment And you're almost looking at a lot of the things that would work really well if you're dealing at all with anxiety in general. So if you're having anxiety or depression issues, some of the same things that will help you with that in general are things that will help when dealing with the writer's block part of that. So they talk about recommending things like exercise, Tony's favorite thing to do, meditation, going for a walk, listening to music. Basically, you're trying to turn off that lizard brain and get yourself out of that limbic mode. And that lets you go back to the creative part. One thing I thought was interesting that I haven't tried, but I'm intrigued with, is they actually seem to think that one thing that may help is light therapy. Does anyone here have seasonal affective disorder or struggled with seasonal affective? If you're ever going to know it, you would know it here in BC with the rain. A little bit. And I find it interesting, Kirsten, when you talk about this happened for you last time, this same time of year, like wondering if, again, there's maybe a little bit of a connection that's happening there. And I don't know if you've ever tried light box therapy.
No, I haven't, but my neighbor uses it. Like, she's been diagnosed. I just am feeling a little bit like I'm not at a really bad level, but it's certainly when it's sunny, I've got energy, and when it's not, I don't. So that's it's kind of tied in there.
Well, and I think just like depression is on a spectrum where you have everything from clinical depression to like I'm feeling down and feeling blue, that something like SAD or seasonal affective disorder is the same thing. So thinking about things like whether or not, and you can buy them at London Drugs, are those light boxes, and whether or not that might help kind of refuel the well. The other thing are those vitamin D drops, which is on my list to pick up. Crystal's a huge proponent. She has tons of energy, so she must be doing something right. Whether or not that's something, again, that are we getting enough vitamin D when we live out here in the West Coast or any place where there's not enough sun and a lot of rainy weather. And again, whether or not that is turning off the parts of our brain that we want to be active during this time period.
So with vitamin D, you can actually absorb quite a bit of it through your skin in the summer, and your body stores that throughout the year. So my doctor actually got me to install an app on my phone. I think it's like called D-Minder or something. And it actually, like, I press start when I go out in the sun, and then it beeps at me before I'm going to burn and says, okay, like cover up or go in.
Yeah.
And it actually tracks for your daily, monthly, annually, and like your blood levels of vitamin D if you record every time.
The other thing that
cool.
I didn't know, go ahead, Crystal.
I was going to say one thing to watch, though, is that only certain parts of your body work. Your face does not count for vitamin D production. It's sort of a dead zone. And there's only certain times of year here where we get that. So if it's set for a location, that's great. But also it does not work when you're wearing sunscreen. So for anybody, just to be aware that you can run around outside all you want, but if you have sunscreen on, it doesn't count, which is why that's really good. If you know sort of what your tolerance is and how long you can spend before you hit that point, that's super valuable to keep track of.
And I didn't used to know, this was knowledge to me, that basically if you're sitting inside and the sun is coming through a window, you're not getting the vitamin D. I was like, well, I'm in the sun, like it's warm or whatever, like, but that's actually not doing it at all. You actually, for all of us introverts, the horror, you actually have to be outside. You have to let the actual sun touch your flesh. So thinking about those kinds of things, I think, is really useful and important. So that, I think, so I'm scrolling through my notes here. So I have all this stuff about what parts of your brain are happening with being creative and sticking people in MRIs and watching the brain parts light up. But basically what it came down to, unless you wanted to get a whole theory and lecture on the brain function, which I suspect you guys may not, is that it's all happening up in that cerebral cortex area, which is the language centers. And there's kind of two different areas of the brain that are lighting up. So one, which is language, which makes sense, of course. And the other is talking about finding relationships between things. So, if I hold up this banana, it looks like a gun. And again, you can see where that's really relevant in terms of writing, where we're often using imagination to sort of build worlds and kinds of things. So we know that we have to be in that part of our brain. And if we're having anxiety and stress, we're going to struggle.
What about the theta brainwave state? And how it affects the way we are able to tap into creativity, like that just falling asleep, just waking up moment, or sometimes through meditation or something, you can access, for me anyway, you can access stories, just sort of bubble up.
Okay. Thanks so much. I'm moving here in the library. Keep talking and we'll move together. Keep talking, Marianne. You use...
no, I've wondered what the actual psychology is, what you guys know about that. Because I sometimes have whole stories or sometimes solve story problems when I'm kind of in that gray zone. And I don't know if that's a thing that happens in the cerebral cortex or whether other parts of the brain are involved or what exactly. That's all.
Well, one of the things you can do is you can feed your brain some stuff to chew on while you sleep. And it's actually extraordinarily effective if you have any kind of story problem or, a technical issue you can't solve around something or just some plot thing you're not sure of. You can actually reread through a scene or remind yourself of what it is you want to figure out. And you tell yourself, okay, I'm going to go to sleep now. I'm going to leave you to work on this. And when you wake up in the morning, it's shocking how frequent you will have solved that in your sleep. Your brain doesn't really shut off. It just keeps on going. And most information is actually encoded sort of from short-term to long-term memory while you're sleeping. A lot of that happens. So it's quite fascinating what you can get out of your sleep time in terms of story processing.
And it is that the process that Crystal's talking about when things are going from short-term memory to long-term memory, we think is part of that problem-solving capability because, of course, the older you get, the more experiences you've had, the more things that you can rely on and build on. And so what we're looking for is that idea that your brain starts searching out connections, like, oh, this situation reminds me of this thing. This thing was similar to this thing. And so we sometimes are finding connections or ways to solve that problem through that. So to some degree, it's like accessing your subconscious, things that you're not necessarily consciously thinking about. So opening those up is what's useful. And in fact, there are programs, meditations, one of the biggest ones that's trying to kind of get that part of your brain flexible and moving.
Well, like this brain entrainment thing too.
Yeah, and there are tons of brain training things where, and the idea is really just to open up the different parts of your brain so that you're using all the different information that you would have piled in there.
So the kind of thing that I'm having difficulty with, because I don't study brain science or psychology, but we've got all these different brain parts, not just the prefrontal cortex and the limbic, but all these other bits that seem to be linked more to our senses or to memory or emotion or different things like that. And at the same time, we kind of glibly talk about conscious versus subconscious. And I'm just wondering whether what we mean by subconscious is that this kind of doorway to all these other brain parts, including long-term memory storage, are more open and accessible. I don't know. I don't have the language to talk about.
You're making perfect sense to me. So, I mean, I think what is useful to think about is when I used to work on the brain injury unit at GF Strong, we talked about the brain being a company. So different parts of the brain do different functions, right? So there are parts of the brain that are in charge of maintenance, right? So they're the ones who are regulating heat in the building being your body. There are parts that are, the communications department, there's the management department, there's all these different functions. And so when you have a brain injury, often what the challenge is depending where that injury occurs, results in what kind of problem then you then have going forward. So for example, if you're taken out in the occipital lobe, then you're going to have problems with speech and those kinds of things. So you'll have different areas that'll come up. So there's just different things that happen. So really when we kind of talk subconscious and unconscious, we're talking about like what you're aware of versus what you're not necessarily aware of. And anything that kind of makes that barrier a little bit more fluid and open is usually a good thing. Did that help or make it more complicated?
No, it's just that they're kind of like two different dimensions. I got one's geography and one's something else.
Art.
So one of the things I did find interesting is, so now that we kind of know what writer's block is and we know where it's coming from, is I think then first identifying for ourselves, like, what do we think is causing the writer's block? So one, maybe it's not block at all, cycling back to the first part of the discussion. Maybe it's not that I'm blocked, it's just that I'm in a period of fallow and I'm just enjoying, bringing in some other interesting ideas and I'm letting that go. Or it could be that I've got something going on emotionally and so I'm dealing with that, and that's the kind of first thing. But this is a lovely piece of homework. One of the best things you can do is read. And there's actually a lot of interesting studies that show that when you're exposed to other creative ideas, it sparks the creative centers in our own brains. Mm-hmm. So that is a good exercise for inhaling as many books as you possibly can. But I also take creative ideas to be bigger than that. So going to the movies, movies are a great idea. Going to the art gallery. If people haven't seen the exhibit that's at the Vancouver Art Gallery right now, it's well worth an idea to sort of spark some creativity, the Gao Pei exhibit. But looking at those kinds of things will help you kind of open up and expand your own creative ideas. So doing that. The second most common piece of advice for doing writer's block is exactly what we do in our sprints, which is writing without stopping. So the idea that you're just going to set a timer for a period of time and you're going to write in that time period, and you're going to turn off the part of you that wants to say it's not working or that it's no good or those kinds of things. So you're in luck because we have writing sprints every morning. And we are now starting them up in the evenings as well. So we have some peer-led writing sprints. But you certainly don't need us if you need to do that. You can also set your own timers. How many people know that? I was thinking of it as the tomato method, the Pomodoro method. So know that. And that's the idea of setting sort of a 25 minutes, right? So you're setting a timer that you're going to get work done and doing things in those kinds of chunks. And that can be really useful. So if you are finding yourself challenged and struggling, lying to yourself, as you pointed out, is a great way of being like, I only have to do this for insert time period here. And then once that period is over, I'm going to give myself permission and forgiveness to walk away from the computer. And of course, what often happens is you then end up staying. Like you actually do find it, like once the ideas start flowing, you kind of give yourself permission to do it. I think the problem is we often link our inability to write to what that means. I'm having trouble writing, therefore I'm not a real writer. I'm having trouble writing, therefore this story idea is no good. I'm having trouble writing, therefore insert whatever large, overly negative thing could go in there, right? But it's usually not just like, I'm just not writing. We make it into something much bigger and much larger. So thinking about that. There is something around sometimes also cueing our brain. So whether that's a particular place, so this is the place where I write, where our brain just kind of starts to be like, oh, I'm here, I'm in that spot, this is what I'm going to do. So that can help. For some people, it's other types of sensory things. So I know some people who have a particular scented candle, and some people will actually buy scented candles based on the book that they're writing. So if it's an outdoor book, it's got the pine tree smelling kinds of things. And if it's, something else there, so they're picking a scented candle to hopefully kind of drop them into the feeling of that book. Music, I'm not sure how many people use music to write to.
Not so much lately.
Only when there's construction noise that needs to be drowned out.
And I know, for example, Crystal will often have a particular song and she will just play that song on repeat over and over and over and over and over again while she's writing.
I used to do it a lot more.
I'm sure it's a great delight to Crystal's neighbors. I bet they love it hearing it 5 times in a row or 20 times in a row. Chris was like, yes, they do.
Headphones, because it's more like hundreds of times. I will actually listen to one song the entire time I'm writing a novella. So it might be for weeks that one song is on repeat. It's just to set the emotional tone. And I don't hear it after the first hour or whatever it is. It just kind of like makes grooves in a record in my brain, and it's almost like a meditative state where it just sets you in a place that you want to be. And then every time I hit play on that song, it's easy to jump right back into the story. So I'm a behavioral therapist by background, so it's effectively the bell you ring to get the dogs to salivate. It's the bell I ring to get myself writing. And what I realized after doing that for a while, I was putting the headphones on and I had stopped hitting play on the music at some point. And it was, for certain books, like I'll get to a point where all I have to do is put the headphones in. I don't even need the music, but it's the stimulus that triggers a response, which is your fingers making words on the page. So it wasn't until I went to do edits that I realized actually, because normally I'm like, oh, I got to turn off the music if I'm, editing is a different piece of the process than just writing the story in the first place. And I realized it wasn't even on. I had something to turn off.
I kind of quite love that. Oddly enough, one of the questions I get asked most often when I'm doing interviews for books that are out is people will say, what's the playlist for the book? And I'm often like, oh, I don't have one. So I think sometimes if you're writing, it's not a bad idea to be like, are there different songs that kind of fit for this particular book? And that might be, again, another cue. So music, candles, space, any of those kinds of things, special writing socks, different things that for your brain just sort of cue it in that now is the time, and it becomes a little bit more of an automatic response. And that's basically what you're trying to do.
I mean, that's what we're doing with the writing sprints in the morning, because there are days I sit down and I'm tired, I'm not into it, I got nothing. So I'll just go through yesterday's scene and I'll pick and poke and I'll add a few words and I'll change a couple words, and I'll sit there for the entire hour and get nothing accomplished. But sometimes at the end of the sprint, something kicks in, and then after that I'll write 1,500 words or something, or a whole new scene or two. So just having to show up and look at the look at the manuscript.
Yeah, showing up is often the idea of, we started talking about, people were saying, the problem is like, if I stop writing, the longer I go without writing, the harder it is to get back to it. That doing something like the sprints or showing up for something like that, even if you end up rearranging the same 10 or 15 words over and over again, the beauty of it is that by doing that, your brain is just like, well, I'm here, I might as well do something. Because of course, the longer that you're not doing it, the more we can build it into being something that it's not. And again, that's the last point that they bring up, which is going to be a perfect segue into tomorrow's office hours that Dawn is going to do, which is to be really careful about negative self-talk. And it's really so easy to fall into that category, to be like, I'm not a writer, I'm not a good writer, everything I'm writing is crappy, everyone else is doing better than this, I should have been further along. I was talking to someone over lunch this week, and she was saying, I was so sure I would have this book done by now, and really beating herself up for it. And it was like, well, unless you can go back in time, you can't go back, but you could write it now. Like nothing has happened that would stop you from writing the book now. Like, yeah, you thought you would have it done before Christmas, but you don't. So what are you going to do now? Like, you can't go back. But it's so easy to be that really negative bit. So having that kind of habit, or as Bonnie talks about it, that routine where you put yourself in that space and you're turning out words and you're not beating yourself up, are all things that are going to go a long way to making that work a whole lot better. Anyone else have any other tips that they're using to kind of tackle writer's block?
Kind of coming on to what you're just saying about negative self-talk. I think her name was Michelle Fogal, gave a talk one year at the Creative Ink Festival, where she talked about not being a bad boss to yourself. Like, I think we've all had that situation where we've had some ass who's our boss that's just pointing out all of our flaws. Nothing is ever good enough. and how much we hated that person and how little motivation we had to do a good job for that person. And then realizing that you're doing that to yourself with your self-talk, that you're just finding faults and you're never giving yourself a pat for the things that are good. So yeah, sometimes I'll hear myself being a negative and I'll be like, don't be Brian. Brian was an asshole. I hated Brian.
It's good to give him a name.
Somewhere out there, we all have a Brian. So yeah, I think doing that and replacing negative talk, it's not just enough, I think, sometimes to stop negative talking, but replacing it with something positive. So, catching yourself, and that's basic cognitive behavioral therapy. So instead of saying, I'm no good at writing dialogue, I'm getting better at writing dialogue, or like even just changing it. Like you don't have to be like, I'm awesome. Like, especially if that just feels to you like it's just this huge lie. Like I'm getting better at this thing, or I'm working at this. So kind of avoiding those absolutes of I never finish a book. Like I haven't finished a book yet is a way of just changing that even just ever so slightly to giving yourself a little bit more of a positive spin. And that's partly what Donna's going to talk about tomorrow is setting up positive affirmations. So again, not just that you're not being negative, but that you're setting up the positive stuff for yourself to kind of encourage yourself to be a non-Brian in your own head.
Yeah. And I've also, a lot of us think of things as like easy or hard, and we expect things to be easy. I think especially a lot of us that grew up as good students, we expect if we're smart, it'll be easy. And if it's hard, that means we're stupid. Reframing it to be
really
challenging instead of calling it hard is like, oh, it's a challenge. I'm rising to the challenge. I am challenging myself. I am doing something challenging. And I think that's a way, I don't know, for me, it makes me look at it as something I'm achieving instead of.
Really good.
Yeah.
I have a friend, Serena Robar, and she has a comment that her teacher said to her that always stuck with her, which is, the more you're good at things, the harder it is to be great. And the idea behind that was like, if you're good at stuff, then it's much harder to just push yourself, which I think is what you're talking about, which is like, well, I'm just good. Like I can get an A with just basically showing up and making some attention. And so to really push yourself and be like, it's not good enough to just get that A. I'm going to push myself to know this inside out, to be the best at it, to do those kinds of, is that much harder. And yeah, then when something doesn't come easy, we think, well, then I must not be good at it. Therefore, I shouldn't do it. Versus, as you're saying, like, okay, no, that's just a little bit of a challenge. Yeah, I think Janine's comment in the chat window, if people see it, is also thinking about like, how can you make it fun again? And if you remember in the last office hours, one of the questions that I gave Leslie to think about with her book was going back and remembering, why did you want to write this book? Like there was something that had you all fired up to sit down and write a book, and you were, running around and making notes in little tiny notebooks and, boring other people at dinner conversations about your imaginary friends and what things they were up to. And you were all fired up. And then sometimes when we're in the middle of the actual writing, we lose track of that. We forget what it was that we had a passion for. And there was something that drove us to want to write that book. So what is that thing? And can we find that thing again and kind of touch back into it? And that will sometimes help. Other tips that people are using?
I just wanted to say that whenever I stall, because I tend not to call it a block, there's always a reason. And so I usually have to stop beating myself up and I go, okay, there has to be a reason. I have to figure this out. And it could be any one of those reasons you listed, but most often for me, it's because something I wrote took me in the wrong path and I have to go backwards. And I don't want to go backwards, so I resist it because that's like undoing work. But that's my biggest one. When I know, and I have to admit, that something must have gone off the rails or I took a misdirection, and I have to go back. I have to reread what I did, and or sometimes just take a day off and let it mull in my head, and then it's really obvious the next morning.
Yeah, it does become somehow strangely more clear. Or doing the thing like just before you go to bed, thinking about it can sort of help with that kind of stuff too. I often find that changing my routine when I feel that resistance sometimes is helpful. So I'm someone who writes on my laptop, like 99.9% of my books are all drafted on my laptop. So if I'm finding like it's not working, I shut the laptop down, I go paper pencil. I often go to a different space. So I very rarely write at coffee shops. I tend to write better at home. But if I'm blocked, sometimes strangely enough, going to a coffee shop or going to a public place, it's not my usual writing routine, somehow shakes up something in my head that makes it easier to do it. And I'm just free writing. And maybe it's taking the stakes down. Maybe it's the feeling like, well, I'm not really writing because I'm doing it on paper pen and not on a laptop. So my brain's like, okay, we'll allow you to think about it, this thing in this different way. But we do know, for example, that handwriting activates different parts of the brain than keyboarding. So maybe that, again, going back to Marianne's thing about getting different parts of our geography involved might be part of it. Doing vision boards or doing some kind of pictorial kind of thing, again, lights up a different part of the brain. So it just might be enough to shake something free, if that makes sense. Other thoughts on how people are mastering writer's block?
I have a request for homework for you, which means you need to give me homework. So one of the things I find really hard is when a story feels like it matters too much. Like when you know the idea is really good. That's the scary part, and it feels really important, that particular story, and it matters a lot to you, and you're really invested in it, and you can have done all the research in the world and you can picture every single grain of sand in that story, in that world. But when it comes time to pull it out of your head and try and make what's on the paper fit what's in there, like I find those are the ones and I'm currently stuck on one of them right now. Like I can't seem to get it out, and I can't seem to get past that feeling of like, oh my God, I don't know if I can do this justice. And I'm worried, like if I start and it's not coming out the way that I see it, I'm worried about the implications of that. So yeah, it feels like it's a big thing. So I would be curious as to any sort of suggestions around.
I think it's just that same self-doubt, but because of your elevated investment in that particular story, it whatever, it maybe doesn't bother you most days of the week, it's just surfacing because you feel like there's more at stake.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What if you gave yourself a half hour to write it wrong?
Yeah.
Go with what is absolutely, like, I really want to write a story about coming to love yourself and all that kind of stuff, and being like, okay, well, I'm going to write that the complete wrong way to do that.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it like the exact opposite of what I would suggest that this character do, just to almost put a line in the sand about this is where it is. And then everything's going to be better than that. Everything you write after that is going to be closer to what it's supposed to be. Might help you kind of do that thing.
Yeah. And Kristen said maybe it's not finished cooking, but this one's been cooking for 15 years. I think it's
cooked.
At this point, we're done. It's at the disintegrated, like pulled pork level of story. It's
that fear is just an elevated version of the everyday doubts that we have about our writing abilities or whatever, or our insight into a particular story or character. So it's no different than anything else we write, but somehow because it's important, we want it to come out perfect the first time. I mean, all you have to do is tell yourself that you don't expect that ordinarily, so why should it happen this time? And once it's down,
it is, I think, a lot about giving yourself that permission that it's not going to be. It's okay that it's not going to come out good.
The start, right?
Right.
I think a bit of it is a fear that later you'll do it better. Like you're going to use up the idea if you do it now. You're not a good enough writer, and later you'll be better, and it'll be better if you just save it for later when you're better.
Yep, that's precisely it. Especially when you know that there's readers out there. Like I have to say, that's that becomes a very different thing. Like writing the second book in a duo where the first one has already sold a lot of copies, and you know that all those people have expectations around those characters now and around how that story is going to end. So it's disconcerting to think about the people on the other end as well, which I think you don't necessarily have, like when you do the first one with a set of people. It feels like a fresh canvas. Nobody has expectations. They haven't finished that story in their minds already. So yeah, I guess it's just an interesting, just the different, I like the puzzle to solve, challenge to live up to, rise up to, whatever. I think those are good. Yeah.
I think the other thing that I would put a pin in to think about is, because I really like what you're saying around, like, you don't want to use up this idea, is giving yourself permission that you can actually write that idea multiple different times, and you probably will. I will always remember being on a panel and, getting the interview question. Someone's like, every book that you've written is about a character coming to terms with who they really are and what they're capable of doing. What interests you about that? And I had this total moment where I was like, holy shit, every single book I've ever written has been about a person figuring out what they're capable of. And I hadn't realized that. Like, for me, it's like I am going back to that same idea kind of again and again and again. And so for me, it was understanding
fiction, right?
Well, and I think every author has like certain things that kind of drive their writing. So whatever that core idea is, Crystal, for you, where it's like, I know I want to do this idea justice, you will do it justice, and you may do it justice at different times and in different ways. So that may help. But my hunch is you're doing all the things that which is, trying to break the idea down. So like, I'm just going to write one scene, trying to trick yourself with writing for 5 minutes. And if those aren't working, then I might give a go to like, I'm going to write the worst version of this I can possibly imagine, just because I suspect it'll make you laugh and might free something up. So that's your homework.
Bad draft. Here we go.
There you go. All right. Well, I'm going to thank Crystal in particular for being the one to do the recording. And I'm going to thank the North Vancouver Library for letting me sit in their space tonight while I don't have a house. And I'm going to thank you guys for coming. Just a reminder, Donna is going to do my office hours tomorrow morning, and it's going to be on affirmations. So hopefully everybody can make it for that. All right. Thank you, Crystal. You can turn our recording off. And until then, I will see you guys around the academy. Thanks so much.